Hi, welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, so welcome to our CMO Circle panel, Beyond Greenwashing, Building Authentic Sustainable Brands. My name is Rachel Dennis, and I'm going to be moderating today's session. Before I ask our panelists to introduce themselves, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to be recording this session. Please do ask any questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll answer those throughout our time together. And maybe whilst we wait for a few more people to join, maybe if you can start by sharing in the chat your role and company and what you hope to get out of today's session. Okay. All right. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to welcome our panelists, Neil Campbell, Katie McPhee, and Mark Nelkin. And thank you for agreeing to share your insights and expertise on this subject with us. So first of all, if you could please introduce yourselves to the group, maybe we can start with Neil.
Yes, so I'm Neil Campbell. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at Small. Small is a direct-to-consumer sustainable cleaning kind of brand. So we're basically on a mission to remove all the kind of plastic and nasty chemicals and various other kind of environmental harming activities out of the cleaning industry. And we operate in the UK, France, and Germany.
And Katie.
So I'm Katie McPhee. Besides from being a small early adopter, I help scale mission-driven organizations as a commercial leader and advisor, specializing in B2B and marketplace businesses. Been working with a lot of businesses in the climate space over the past couple of years. And I'm also involved in various early stage innovation initiatives, including Earth AI, which is a climate and AI event series.
Thank you. And Mark.
Yeah, hi, Mark Nelkin. I'm a sustainability brand and comms specialist. That means I'm helping organizations create more powerful brand and communications around sustainability. I also help to put together teams, processes, and structures so that brands are set up for success ongoing in the long term. Started in advertising agencies, moved into more purposeful work at an agency called Futera, where we help brands build sustainability strategies, sustainability positionings and propositions, and also complete rebrands and communications campaigns. Now working independently as a consultant.
Excellent, thank you. And yes, my name's Rachel Dennis. I'm a fractional and interim CMO, and I'm currently interim at a clean technology company called TerraFend. And our mission is to replace harmful cleaning solvents that are used in the manufacturing process with a water-based solution that increases site safety and reduces the volumes of hazardous waste and VOCs that are released into the environment. So before we begin the main session, I'd just like to set some context for our discussion. So although there is no current legal definition for the term greenwashing in the UK, broadly it's used to describe untrue or misleading statements about the environmental performance or impact of a business product or service. There are a number of important regulatory codes in the UK, in particular the Competition and Market Authority's Green Claim Code, GCC, and the Advertising Standards Authority's CAP Code. And we'll provide links to those in our follow-up email. Now, non-compliance with these regulations can lead to significant penalties, including fines of up to 10% of global turnover. Now, I do want to be clear, Katie, Mark, Neil, and I are not experts on these regulations. We're not going to be offering legal advice during this session, but our aim is to give you some insights into how you can build authentically sustainable brands and be aware of the associated challenges that come with that, so that you can be confident in your claims and build trust with your audiences. So on to our first question, which I would like to ask each of our panelists to answer. And that is, what does greenwashing mean to you? And maybe you can share some examples of what bad looks like. And maybe Neil, you'd like to take that one first?
Yeah, so for me, greenwashing at its heart is it's a fundamental dishonesty. It's an attempt to kind of dupe the customer, that, essentially you are more environmental than you are, normally via, kind of the messaging used or the kind of vague language used and things like that. And like any lie, it's a very hard one to keep up, and eventually you kind of get caught out on it. And for me, I think the worst examples are just ones that they lack any kind of detail or kind of backup or any kind of evidence that sort of supports a kind of claim. And some of my famous ones are things like locally sourced where possible, which is just a meaningful statement. It's just like, well, what does that mean? Would like define possible, define local, that sort of thing. Again, plant-based biodegradable ingredient, like which ingredient, how much of the kind of formulation is it? Isn't everything that's plant-based pretty much biodegradable? Um, and so I think that those are the kind of worst examples of it. But I also think it's a corporate kind of dishonesty, which also kind of happens in beyond environmental things. So I always thought the classic was Tropicana putting on their thing, one of your five a day, which is basically a way of kind of corrupting a sort of well-meaning government initiative to then sort of say, oh yeah, but this like very sugar high orange juice that's been filtered within an inch's life actually counts like a piece of fruit. And it's like, so it is something that kind of happens all the time. But fundamentally it's dishonesty because it's not backed up with any evidence or any kind of supporting sort of knowledge or science behind it.
Thank you. And Katie, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think building on what Neil said, all of the above, I think anything that's meant to give the veneer of a green purchase in the eyes of the consumer. And I think we see various degrees of this. So whether it's in our fast fashion favorites, the range that have all got a big green leaf on the labels, but in reality, they have 5% recycled polyester in them. So it's, negligible how green that purchase is, would be one extreme. On the other side, the coffee pod maker Keurig in the US has just been fined $1.5 million by the SEC for claiming that its pods are recyclable. And in the ruling, the SEC had sort of investigated this and found that the two biggest recycling companies had said it's just not viable to recycle these. And the manufacturer still hasn't come out and actually said one way or another, that it is or it isn't. They're just sort of being completely ambiguous, and they've removed that claim. But just to demonstrate it, yeah, I think there's quite big extremes there between how the extent to which companies are trying to mislead.
And Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other two have summed it up pretty well on the whole, but there's so much inherent in the way that we build brands and speak as brands that just isn't applied when we start talking about sustainability. Brands maybe aren't the most trusted things in the world sometimes, but when it comes to sustainability, it seems to go a step further. And I think whether it is the imagery or the language or the claims that Neil and Katie have already spoken about, I always look to things like kind of lofty macro sustainability statements as opposed to sort of the specifics of what a brand is actually doing. I think we're way beyond kind of these big macro statements now. So when a brand's not being specific, you really got to worry. When they're using jargon that isn't fundamentally plain English, you've got to start worrying. When there's no authenticity there. And we may talk about it later as well. We talk about greenwashing, but green hushing is something that has become, frankly, probably as much of a problem as greenwashing. And I know that kind of could be a broader discussion, but the harm that green hushing is doing is also incredibly important to raise. It's kind of like, unless you're perfect, don't talk about it. Unless you're 100% this or that, just don't say anything. And that is so dangerous as well. So we've got the dangers of greenwashing, which I think, we'll go into more detail, but also green hushing is just as important nowadays.
So basically, green hushing is where you're not talking about something, or you're just kind of leaving that out of your communications because it's a problem for your your
Yeah,
product?
there's a fear, and I think there's a fear because we've all seen the amount of bad press that so many brands have had, and how harmful brands fear that can be. But that fear is overriding their ability to actually communicate really powerful, positive messages. You don't have to have completed something. You don't have to be at 100%. As long as you can be, I feel like I might use the words honest and authentic too many times across the next hour.
Mhm.
But if you can be honest and authentic in your communication as a brand and the way you build your brand, that's going to be so much more a powerful tool than if you don't say anything at all. And brands are being scared into not saying anything when they've got some really positive, powerful messages.
That is the perfect segue to my next question, which is for Neil. So as CGO at Small, what have been the biggest challenges and successes in embedding sustainability into your brand's DNA? Because, it doesn't seem to me that there is fear in Small, and you're very forward in going out with your sustainability message. So can you tell us a little bit more about the challenges and successes of doing that?
Yes, absolutely. I could talk for hours about this, but I'll give you the shortened version. So for us, it's interesting you talk about DNA because the kind of founding sort of DNA of Small was really about how do we have the biggest impact on the kind of cleaning industry and make it more environmentally kind of friendly. And so that's almost the starting point. And so the challenge then becomes how do you build a kind of business model around that, and how do you kind of build a business that actually works for consumers and can grow around that. And it's very interesting what sort of Mark said there, because one of our challenges that what's in our DNA is to have the most impact, which is actually quite different from being the most 100% environmentally kind of friendly. And so what we actually have to do is kind of go, well, how do we create a business proposition which is mass market and attracts the most people to it? Because we always say it's about sort of 95% of people being sort of 90% more sustainable, not about the sort of 5% being sort of 100% sort of sustainable. And so that's one of the challenges that we have, is how do we build these business models, and how do we have this constantly kind of improving approach to the impact that we have through our kind of products and the impact that we have on the kind of cleaning industry. And sometimes some of those challenges kind of become, or some of the successes become challenges, and sort of vice versa. So for example, in the UK, one of our kind of really innovative things at the start was cardboard packaging for kind of laundry capsules. So just removing all these plastic bottles that you get in laundry liquids, or big plastic tubs that you get for laundry capsules. And we had a very innovative cardboard box that it has to have a child lock on it, so it has to have meet product safety requirements. But we got that, and we kind of launched it in the UK, and it was did us very well, and it's a key part of our success. But actually what happened was that Procter & Gamble copied it across all their kind of brands. And so, they then came out with kind of cardboard packaging, which was kind of great because we're having the impact on the cleaning industry that we kind of wanted. So, it was a success, but at the same time it's a challenge because it's removed one of our kind of points of difference. However, on the greenwashing side, I would note that Procter & Gamble, when they operate in the US, are still using plastic tubs. And it's not a corporate shift that they've made. It's something that, I'd like to think that we've sort of forced upon them in the UK market. And so you got to get these things where you're constantly innovating, but then the market's changing, and then you're trying to push it further, etc. And another sort of success I would sort of say, or kind of highlights our kind of mindset, is we sell fabric conditioner, and fabric conditioner has to come in a sort of liquid kind of format. And so we were selling it in 100% recycled plastic bottles, PET bottles. And that was a great system. We had a system whereby people could return the bottles to us. We were one of the few people in the UK who was really using 100% recycled plastic. So actually providing the demand for people to kind of recycle their plastic. But actually what we realized was, it's just too much effort for people to kind of collect these plastic bottles and return them back to us so that we can sort of, clean them and sort of reuse them. And so the uptake rates were just too low for what we can aspire to as a brand. And so we changed that entire supply chain to one where essentially you keep the plastic bottle, and we send you out essentially what looked like sort of orange juice carton or kind of milk carton style refills. Why do we do that? Because those cartons can be recycled in about 80% of all households and kind of councils that recycle in the UK, and they are properly recycled. So unlike the plastic bottle where we kind of go, yes, you can put it in your recycling now, and it is some of it, like sort of 20% of it or 30% of it is recycled. actually that's not good enough, and we want to move to a format where 80% of people can recycle it, and it actually probably the stuff that goes in does get recycled, and that way we have the kind of biggest impact. And so to really kind of tie it all together, we're always looking for the most impact, and if the business model or the kind of product service that we kind of work out doesn't meet that, then we've got to keep going. We've got to keep innovating all the time. And so that's a real success for us, because we kind of moved the entire range. It suddenly opens up all range of kind of liquids for us that we can sort of, launch and sort of move to for customers. And yeah, I think it's just a good example of where we're constantly kind of building the business around having a total impact.
I love it. So it's sort of that idea of not letting perfection be the enemy of the good, and always just moving forward and learning and being brave in those decisions, right?
Exactly. And I say, if it's about total impact, then you've got to hit a price point, because people aren't going to spend an absolute fortune to just to be better. You got to make it an easy switch for them. And for Small, we are all designed around, it's a mass market proposition, and to make it mass market, you have to make it an obvious choice for people to switch, and that's what we design around.
Right, thank you. That leads us actually nicely into our next question, which I'd like to ask Mark. What are the first steps that brands should take to integrate sustainability into their core values, rather than just treating it as a separate initiative?
Yeah, so there's no one size fits all here. Every business is different, its own specific challenges, its own stage of maturity, its own sort of place on that sustainability journey. Small is also a brand that I love, and Neil and what the team have done there is fantastic. They were very much what I call like a born good. So they originated as a brand with purpose. Most organizations, most brands aren't in that position and need to sort of start from a more difficult starting point potentially. So there are some hard and soft steps. It's probably a half-day talk by itself, but I will try and touch on some of them. I would say, if you haven't already done it, the first thing to do is to make a materiality assessment. A lot of businesses have already done it. You need to understand the impact you're having right now, and that assessment will help you to identify and understand the relative importance of all the sustainability topics associated with your organization and their potential impact on your organization and the importance of them to all of your stakeholders. So it acts as a guide for you to make decisions against. From there, you can pull out themes, you can pull out gaps, priorities, weaknesses, understand which topics you might feel you need to tackle purely internally and operationally, and then understand the issues that you feel actually will resonate most powerfully with your external audiences. It feels like that's your grounding. That's where you can start if you haven't already done it. It can be really powerful, and it provides that sort of, but it's a guiding light. It's not something that will make decisions for you. It's something that allows you to make decisions. I'd then say, on a slightly softer measure, don't leave sustainability just to your sustainability team or your sustainability manager or whoever happens to be there internally, if you have that person. In my experience, the brands that sort of do sustainability the best are the ones that are the most joined up internally. So when sustainability people do their thing and then hand it over to brand and marketing people, that's when things tend to fall down. I believe you need to have sustainability, brand and marketing tackling the problems and planning from the very beginning. And that's how you ensure sustainability is being truly integrated. It's amazing how often that isn't happening. I find sometimes I'm fighting with my clients and my partners to get the sustainability and the brand and the design and the marketing teams all together on day one. It's just not a natural way of working for a lot of brands, and it leads to so many problems later down the track.
A couple of follow-ups on that. Is there, in terms of the material impact assessment, are there any resources or frameworks that we can share that will help people to know what questions they need to ask? Yes, and I maybe I would say this as a consultant. This isn't something I do myself. It can be challenging to try and do it entirely by yourself if you don't have experts of a sort within your organization. What I can do is I can post a link to a couple of organizations that offer really, really strong guidance. I know that it's difficult, isn't it? Sustainability, and we may come to this later, is so often seen as a cost center in so many different ways. And it feels like it's another cost center to say, well, you need an expert for this, you need an expert for that.
but you can run it yourself. But I would say you need expert sustainability guidance to really ensure that it's truly robust.
There's a question from Nicola here. Would love to hear your thoughts on brands that are doing it well in an integrated manner. I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that.
That are doing sustainability well.
In terms of, yes, integrating, internally and doing sustainability well.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk to a couple of people I've worked with. Sometimes it's difficult to know how well they're doing internally until you've worked with them. And the other thing I suppose we should say is, I said up front about, there's a lot of bad press for a lot of brands, even the ones doing very, very well. So no one's doing it perfectly. You can criticize everyone. The brands, even the most authentic brands, everyone's doing their best. It's very, very difficult. So I think I'm going to pick a couple of examples of brands that maybe aren't born good, as I said, Smol are, and are trying to kind of steer that tanker and kind of move from a very traditional model as a brand into something different. Last year, I worked in the States with Target. I mentioned Target just because it's a massive organization, and sometimes you feel like massive organizations, surely they can't be doing any good. And Target have got a long, long way to go, but they've committed to a set of guidelines which will ensure, and they're very strong guidelines, they are good guidelines, to ensure that all of their products will be designed on solid sustainability principles by 2040. Now that's a long way off, but that's every single one of the products that will be in their stores. That's a huge commitment, and that's very strong. They are leaders on minimum wage increases in the States, which is a massive issue over there. They have incredibly stringent criteria for their suppliers. They are a long way into a massive sustainable energy shift, and they've done that. They were struggling to make significant moves for a long, long time, until about 3 or 4 years ago, they got to a point where they started to bring the separate parts of their brand, the separate parts of their business together in meetings, in workshops, around a table at the start of conversations. They weren't just asking a sustainability manager to come up with a strategy or a policy and then present it to the rest of their departments. So Target, even a massive organization like Target, have really made massive steps, partly because of very strong leadership, to be honest, but that strong leadership encouraging all elements of the brand to come together very early on in conversations.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. I love that idea of born good versus made good that you've talked about. Katie, I'd like to ask you, in terms of your perspective on this question, sort of what are the first steps that brands should take to integrate sustainability into their core values?
I think a point that I think is important to make here is that the vast majority of companies in the UK are at the earliest stages. They are the SMBs, and I think, like, in reality, some of the startups that I work with, there are huge financial pressures, particularly in the current climate. And so when I think about this question from their perspective, rather than sort of a multinational, I think there's a slightly different lens to apply. I mean, this is assuming they're not a business with a sort of physical footprint and regulatory requirements anyway, which would then mean they had to do some of the things that Mark's described about the materiality assessments and so forth. But let's take like a software business as an example. Maybe they're in the sustainability space anyway, so then they might feel they have that they want to sort of be really proactive on this. But if they're not, then I think, like, thinking about a stakeholder map is quite an important first step, because at the moment, there's a lot of institutional investors who are requiring their portfolio to be very proactive and take action on this. And I think there's also the consideration that if they're acting in the B2B space, then there's going to be the supply chain question. So there are going to be their customers are then going to be thinking. So I think it's important to think about like a stakeholder map, whether it's alongside or separate from the materiality assessment piece. But then I think there's also about creating accountability, because certainly in an early stage business, there's no sustainability person. Like, often this will sit with ops, but I think that there's that intentionality piece of saying, well, actually, if we're going to be serious about this, if we're going to take moves on sustainability, let's at least give it a home. And then, you know, tactically, there's things about like data storage, there's things about like how do we build our product so that it takes up sort of minimal space on the servers, and then thinking about like operational efficiency, and then, you know, how do we declare this internally, externally, and what's the measure to which we want to be seen to be taking action on this. I think there's some of the more sort of light touch tactical things that can be deployed, but, you know, I do think that the reality is that early stage businesses, they're just not going to have the resources to be as sort of proactive about building a sustainable brand as they might want to be further down the road.
Thank you. Let's move on to our next question. And Mark, you've worked with both B2B and B2C organizations. What are the key differences between building sustainable brands for B2B versus consumer? And then Neil and Katie, I'd love your perspectives as well, both coming from B2B and the consumer side. But maybe Mark, you'd like to kick us off with that question.
Sure. And maybe I'll be just a little controversial in my answer, but for a reason. There are obviously classic key differences in how our communications approach for B2C or B2B brand. Your audience need different things, generally needs to be communicated to a little differently. But if we strip away those classic differentiators, and I think about the work I've done and am doing in building specifically a sustainable brand versus any other type of brand, I don't think there aren't really any other differences, i.e. you set an authentic and powerful sustainability vision to guide brand and organization. You don't, as you said, treat sustainability as a standalone. You ensure it's as integrated as possible. You absolutely have to serve your audience needs, something that often gets forgotten because sustainability is treated as something else. You're transparent and authentic. You build an authentic story. You back it up with specific proof points. And then, sure, it's about the nuance of how you communicate, depending on what type of organization you are. But I suppose I'm all about doing the really strong foundational work up front before you even get to the point of communication. So if you do all of those things, you've got the toolkit of parts to allow you to flex your comms to different audiences. So yes, there are differences, but I'd say at its core, what are the differences in building a sustainable brand from the inside at its core? None really, controversially.
Neil, any reactions to that?
Yeah, I'm going to disagree slightly with Mark. Mostly because I've always worked in a kind of B2C kind of world, and the one thing I've always been jealous of the kind of B2B world is that you can have a deeper conversation with people. You know, you can sit them down in a meeting and really explain how this works and what the trade-offs are. Whereas I operate in a world where, you know, if I send an email to all my customers, even though they're transacting customers, you know, if I'm lucky, 30% of people open it, never mind, you know, read it and to digest it. Similarly, when I'm trying to reach a sort of an audience on sort of Facebook or, you know, via a performance marketing ad, the number of people who don't make it past the first 3 seconds of the ad and things. So by that nature, it just means we have to kind of communicate in a different way. And in some ways, we've got to, as I was talking about before, we have to make the switch very obvious and the kind of proposition very obvious, and not a kind of big sell to a customer. And then also we've got to design the kind of business model to allow that to happen. It also means that we have to kind of look at sort of innovative ways to kind of get the message across. So, you know, at a certain level, you know, small, in terms of the impact we're having, it's really is multifaceted because it's about saving plastic, it's about saving CO2, it's about saving water and not shipping water around the country. It's about harsh chemicals being used that are unnecessary. It's about animal cruelty. It's about, you know, community involvement and, you know, supporting the kind of communities that we live in. All that I cannot fit into a 3-second hook on a kind of performance marketing ad. So we have to find, you know, innovative ways to kind of get that across. And so, for example, we do stuff like on Small, one of our most popular features is just an impact tracker where we just count up how much water you've saved and how many animals haven't died to provide animal fat for your fabric conditioner and how much plastic you've kind of saved in plastic bottles. We also do things like we had lovely little features called a watchometer that basically took out your watching habits and sort of said, you know, what temperature do you run your machine at? Do you ever run the machine half empty? Do you tumble dry your clothes? And really worked out for people, you know, essentially what the kind of monetary impact of that was, which is what they really care about. But actually, in the background, if you're spending money on energy, it means you're using lots of CO2 to kind of do your washing. And so we've got to find sort of really innovative ways to kind of grab people's attention to try and get that message across, because in the B2C world, you just don't have that much attention. As I would love to sit all our customers down and give them a half-hour presentation on why small is wonderful and all the rest. It's just not going to happen, and therefore we've got to find different ways to communicate. So I think Mark's right in the sense that the building the brand's the same, but it's the communication of that to the end user is a lot different in a kind of B2C world.
Katie, is Neil right to feel jealous of us B2B marketers? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I think I would also slightly disagree with Mark, but yeah, building on what Neil said, like I think, and maybe is the question about like how we build sustainable brands for B2B versus B2C, or how we communicate sustainable brands. But I do think within B2B, like if we're thinking about the jobs to be done of our customer, you know, there's the adage that in B2B, customers buy to make their boss look good, whereas in B2C, they buy to make themselves look good. But if we think about that through the lens of sustainability, a B2B buyer is going to be thinking about, well, what are my organization's regulatory requirements? What are my customers going to need to be kind of sharing? And I mean, it's not very sexy when it comes to like building a brand that's like got to think about regulation, but I think you have to communicate the trustworthiness. If you're aiming to build a sustainable brand in B2B, there's got to be that aspect of rigor and of robustness. I think that whereas with B2C, we are talking much more to an ethical motivation. We're talking about a values-led proposition. And so I do believe that the way that we communicate that brand has to be very different for those reasons.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like foundations we're all kind of agreeing on, but then in terms of how we then communicate that out, obviously significant differences between the two. Let's move on to our next question, and this one, Katie, is for you first, please. What are some of the common mistakes you see brands making when it comes to sustainability?
Well, I think building off the point that Mark made before about green hushing. So I mean, this sort of trend was identified a couple of years ago. The sustainability consultancy South Pole did a report, and I think out of 1,400 companies, they redid the report this year actually, but out of 1,400 companies, 20% aren't planning on publicizing their science-based targets, and 58% are planning to reduce the comms about it. So I think this point about green hushing is that it's actually getting bigger as we're seeing more high-profile cases like the Curia getting slapped with fines for misleading through comms. We're just seeing brands and organizations just going to the next level of actually wanting to hush up what they are doing in order to mitigate the risk around being called out for being hypocritical or not doing enough. And I think it is a risk because it inhibits ambition in this area if they think that they're going to get called out one way or another. But then it's going to stop brands being ambitious. And I think it's going to actually slow down the positive action that we know is needed to get us all to more of a net zero place. So so I think that's one common one. And as I mentioned before, I think this tendency to sort of slap a big green leaf on anything that's, you know, even vaguely has any green credentials as well. I mean, that is sort of plain misleading, and that would also fall into that bucket.
Great, thank you. Neil, what mistakes would you add to build on what Katie's just mentioned?
Yeah, I would sort of broaden it slightly and sort of say, this is about building sustainable brands, but it's kind of related to the kind of greenwashing point, which is that I look at a lot of very sustainable brands who simply expect consumers to do too much, or sort of make consumers feel guilty that they're not doing enough. And there's this sort of kind of guilt tripping of kind of people, and I kind of think people have very, very busy lives. It is our job as business leaders and people who are kind of building companies to make the choices obvious to them. And I always kind of called it, in our world, refill shops. They're great. You see them on some high streets, everything else. they're an amazing solution. It's very environmentally friendly. You bring all your kind of boxes there and everything, but it's a lot of effort. You know what I mean? And for someone to be able to kind of use that service, they have to be organized enough. They have to have the time. They have to, have the means to kind of get there. And so it's a solution that only works, as I said before, for the 5%. And what we need to do is just have a lot more brands kind of thinking, how do I design this system and how do I think cleverly about this to make it sort of more obvious and kind of avoid the sort of guilt tripping a bit. And the relation to the kind of greenwashing is so many customer or so many brands do stuff that is right. We've ticked the box. You can recycle your kind of coffee pods or whatever the kind of system is. But then you kind of look at the system and go, that's just really hard to use. That's just really hard for someone to remember to do. When you actually look at where I have to drop this stuff off to, it's like I've got to drive miles to one specific kind of drop off point or something like that. And you're going to go, yeah, you've kind of just pushed the onus onto the consumer there rather than sort of saying, okay, there's got to be a better way that we can think of that's going to like boost sort of participation rates and the total impact. And so, yeah, I think that's the mistake I see. And it does lead into that kind of greenwashing of, well, we've ticked the box and we have a return service, but if no one's using it, then it's pointless.
Yeah.
And it's very similar to the recycling thing of sort of saying, okay, well, oh yeah, we're just going to keep putting this stuff in plastic packaging, but we're going to stick on the box that this can be recycled. Yeah, but if only 20% of plastic that goes into one of these bins is ultimately recycled, then you've not made any difference. So, think about it again and think about it from first principles.
Thank you. And Mark, thoughts for you? Thoughts from you?
Neil, just as you were talking, I was thinking historically the worst version of this, even before sustainability became a thing, really, is the historic, what's that line? As part of a healthy diet that all of the sugar-based food companies used to say, about putting the responsibility onto the consumer there.
Yeah, so it's like the one treat you can have is our product. Just don't eat anyone else's. You know what I mean? It's
it's up to you to ensure. Yeah, ignore our brand. Sort of talking to you night and day about why you should have more of it. I think if I was to pick up something else, I suppose it's already become a little bit of a theme today, but it's about putting your audience first and not treating sustainability different or having it as a standalone. So many brands I talk to seem to put aside their sometimes basic skills as a marketeer. They forget their basic principles. What are your audience's needs, whatever that audience is? What makes sense to your audience in the context of their lives? And talk about the benefits of sustainability in that way. And if sustainability isn't a benefit in that way, either talk about it differently or don't talk about it. You don't always have to talk about sustainability. It has to be in a way that makes sense. It has to be desirable. There's often talk, certainly in my circles, about the value action gap when it comes to consumers with sustainability. But the only real difference between consumers' values and their actions are when their needs aren't met. So it's all about your audience. It's all about fulfilling their needs and then obviously producing a fantastic product or service. But put your audience first, apply your absolute basic marketing principles that sometimes seem to just go out the window when it's sustainability and we treat it a little differently.
Thank you. Okay, just to note, just please, if anyone does have any questions, please pop them in the chat and we can answer them. Cool. Now, we did have, as part of our registration process, we had a few questions that were submitted regarding KPIs and how companies can create meaningful KPIs for sustainability that resonate with both stakeholders and consumers. Mark, would you like to address that question?
Yes, sure. KPIs is a really complex matter. If I was going to say one thing, it's be specific. I said at the very start, sort of, we're past the time of sort of big goals without facts to back them up. Past the time when the potential impacts of climate issues were years away, and so kind of big goals were thrown around without real plans of how to make them happen. It's not about grand dreams anymore. It's about what you're going to do. It's about it's not about what you're going to do. It's about what you're doing. So what are the specifics? For me, why being specific resonates with all of your stakeholders and consumers is because for the people inside your business. They need to know exactly what the business will do. The managers need specific metrics to manage and incentivize and evidence. Your investors want to know why certain issues are material and where the risks are. Regulators obviously need to know that there's proof behind the claims. Customers need to know that their suppliers' carbon data I suppose, because it's their scope 3. Your consumers want to know that the brands that they love are taking real, genuine action on the things that are really important to them in their lives and not just paying lip service to it. So your KPIs need to be specific because the specifics are important to everyone and because it's the specifics that get things done. So if there's one thing to focus on, as I've said again, it's specifics, I suppose, with KPIs.
So that goes back to really what Katie was saying about mapping out all the different
Absolutely.
stakeholders and then sort of mapping the KPIs to each of those stakeholders. Great,
Yeah.
thank you. We have a question from Nicola. Do you see any differences in the importance of sustainability to customers in different markets? Nicola, do you mean different geographic territories or different markets in terms of sectors? I'll come off mute. No?
I can answer it from the geographic perspective.
Sorry, did you want a bit more information on my question?
Yeah, it was just in terms of markets. Do you mean geographic sectors or geographic territories or?
Yeah, it was. I mean, there's two, I guess. One is like within segments within your audience, but also with different markets. So are you seeing that it's more important in, say, I'm really stereotyping here, in the Nordics than perhaps the UK, and less important in other markets, maybe the US? I'm just interested to hear whether you approach it differently depending on the geography.
Yeah, I can certainly talk about Small a little bit. As I said at the start, we operate in UK, France, and kind of Germany, all largely kind of, Western European, kind of very well developed markets. So I think the level of, acknowledgement or kind of interest in sustainable practices is probably the same across all those kind of markets. What actually differs is, the issues that are kind of important to them. So, the classic example, and this is not really relevant to Small, but the classic example is nuclear power. So in the UK, we don't talk about it. In France, it's 80% of their kind of power grid is nuclear, and they absolutely love it because it's very energy kind of sustainable. In Germany, they've had a massive reaction kind of against it. So, even within sort of three, very similar Western markets, that's like one issue that is, it just varies massively as the public perception and how the media kind of plays that. And then I would also sort of say that, within markets, it sort of evolves over time based on the kind of, where the kind of conversation's going and things like that. So, certainly in the UK, we've sort of moved a lot from pure sort of CO2 and sort of energy usage to a lot more kind of microplastics and, the real impact of using kind of plastic and stuff. And so you get that sort of evolution over time, and sort of some of the messages basically kind of change. And so for us, it's sort of that's why we have these sort of like 6 sort of factors that we kind of work on, between water usage and CO2 and community involvement and things. Just because it does evolve over time, and I think you've got to kind of cover those bases as well.
So, and do you, Neil, segment your audience based on how important certain sustainable issues are?
We certainly segment the comms. The customers who are most engaged tend to be a lot more sort of, concerned about environmental issues, whereas the customers who are sort of less engaged but just going to want to get on with it, just want to know that they're doing their bit. So they don't need to be educated about the newest thing and sort of in environmental stuff, but they, the more active, they just want to know that they're kind of having the impact and they've done their bit. The more engaged ones definitely do want to know all the stuff that backs up our kind of, better for the planet kind of credentials. So some of the certification stuff and some of the kind of like life cycle kind of reports and things like that. And so it's, we sort of segment it in the sense that those who pay attention and sort of really subscribe to the newsletters and really get into detail will get all that detail. But those who just want to treat us as a transactional service get this sort of nice reassurance anytime they log into their account, but not much more than that.
So interesting. I've got loads more questions, Rachel, but I'm going to let you go back to some of the others before I.
No, that's okay. You can ask another, because the next question we have is our final question. So if there are any more questions from anybody, please do share.
Really, really greedy here. One on B2B for Rachel and Katie. When you're selling in, is there a persona that is owning this, like the chief sustainability officer? And who do you find is usually the biggest advocate supporting them? And where's the biggest blocker? I don't want to say the CFO, because that would just be too typecast.
Katie, do you want to go first, and then I can...
We're talking about sustainability services specifically here, Nicola.
Yeah.
I think what I have seen is that, I mean, again, like having worked with a few different platforms in this realm, but regulation seems to be the hugest driver. And where there's, we'll take the example of like CSRD, it's on the horizon. Certainly with one of the organizations that I was working with, we did notice a shift. Like it was initially sustainability officers attending our webinars, engaging with our events, but actually then you start to see the CFOs and like perhaps operational team members like COOs joining, engaging, like coming onto the CRM. So I think that's sort of, there's some of the early signs that actually this is becoming an operational issue, and this is becoming something aside from just the sustainability team.
Yeah, I totally agree with the CSRD. So we have 5 different personas that we target at Terrafend, and one of those is health, safety, and sustainability managers and regional directors. And the challenge is that, at the moment, sustainability, they don't have big budgets. And they are that kind of, off at the side, especially in manufacturing. But with CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Disclosures, it's a bit of a mouthful that Katie mentioned. The whole idea of this is that you raise your sustainability metrics to the same level as financial metrics. So that's why you've got CFOs now joining on those calls.
Right.
And this is the idea that it will drive business transformation. So the spirit is in terms of disclosure, but what it does is provides transparency across organizations. So I can see how you're performing against your claimed targets and metrics as a competitor or a consumer. And the idea is that the market then will kind of guide and dictate sort of where investment goes. So I think that CSRD is going to be really important regulation for driving a lot of innovation and change and transparency.
And are you seeing a growth in the number of people with that job title now?
Not yet. We haven't seen it yet, but I think it definitely will come. I think, Katie, is it right? They have to report on 2024 next year. I think that's the calendar. So next year will be the first year they have to disclose.
I have one more question, which is to Mark, because I'm stealing this value to action, which is a much more articulate way of me frequently saying what customers say they want isn't always what they actually do. So you do a survey and everyone goes, yeah, this is super important to me. It's got to be really green and sustainable. And then when it comes to, and it costs me 50p, £2 more. Oh no, I'm not going to, driven by price. How do you handle that? And how do you get them to move from action to value?
Yeah, I mean, it's the question, right? And of course, everyone, in the questionnaire, everyone's going to say, of course, I'd prefer to buy a product that is, less harmful, is fit for the planet. Then, they backtrack when it comes to purchase. So there's always going to be a blockage if the price is in excess, or even especially far in excess of an equivalent. That's always going to be a challenge. So my cop out is to say that's a really tough business decision, and a business needs to try and work out where the balance and where the compromise comes, where kind of corporate benefit balances with sustainability benefit. When it comes to externally as a brand, all you can do is do the basics, which is truly understand, you asked the question very early on, but truly understand what is really important to consumers and customers, but in the context of their lives, not theoretically on a questionnaire, but what is truly going to make their lives better. We should be producing product and services that enhance people's lives, not just product for product's sake, which is a whole other sustainability conversation in itself. But if the product genuinely is going to enhance something in somebody's life, in a person's life, if you can build a brand which is convincing, has an emotional connection to that person and that person's life, and you can back it up with a credible, very specific story, that's the way you start to build that connection and build the level of trust and build the likelihood of people paying more. It's an issue. If you can only produce a sustainable product by it being significantly more expensive, we've lost to a degree. There's no magic dust. There's no magic formula that says this is how you get people to pay significantly more for a product just because it's more environmentally friendly or it does more social good. It just won't happen, especially we're in a massive economic, I was going to say downturn, a permanent potentially economic downturn at the moment. The cost of living globally is in crisis. So we need to find internal solutions, sadly, as brands and businesses. We need to find the products that are correct, and we need to find ways of, unfortunately, creating commercial solutions that work for our consumers, as well as emotional brand solutions. I wish there was a magic bullet. I've yet to see one.
I think it's really true what you say, though, because I'll be really honest with you. I only tried Smol because I've been at an event with Neil. I should probably try it and then I'll go back. But I really love the products, and I won't go and get them all. But it's now been a year that I've been using them, and it was just because I actually thought they were much better than what I was using before.
Yeah.
And the added bonus that was that it felt much better for me and for the environment. So that was why I've stuck with it, though, because they felt just nicer to use.
Yeah.
And I agree. I'm a Smol user as well. But you've got to think about, frankly, this is us. And when you think about sort of the mainstream, which maybe isn't us in a lot of ways, and what's affordable for the majority, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. Why, we all know the online fashion brands, Shein, apologies to anyone connected, diabolical. But they're flying at the moment. They really are, because they're making product accessible by it being cheaper. It is a massive challenge. There's a bigger story that needs changing, that brands can help, but it's not all about the brands that need to change that story. There's a story that needs changing over time. It's quickly.
Yeah. And it will change, because
Yeah.
I think things like, it's a bit like kind of food labeling on, kind of fat and sort of sugar content and things like that. I think you're going to see more mandated. So I think we're at the stage of the legislation is on protected terms and what words you can use. I think it's going to increasingly become actual standard sort of reporting and kind of labeling and that sort of stuff that something like Shein would look very kind of bad on. So I think it will change, but it'll like anything legislative or kind of government, it takes a long time. So it'll get there eventually.
And there are also, there are programs or products that are being created. IKEA has its problems, but is also often held up as a kind of a sustainability leader. So it probably sits somewhere in between. But 3 or 4 years ago, when they started taking their waste product, as they called it, the wastage in the production line and returned goods, and repackaging them and reselling them, I think in the first 12 to 18 months, I don't have the figures to hand, but it was something like 65% of all potential waste products were repackaged and resold. So they were reducing their overall carbon footprint, which is part of the story, but actually they were providing very convenient goods to people, and sales grew by something quite significant. So there was something like they were reducing their carbon footprint significantly, but I think overall sales increased by 5 or 6% also just in those 12 to 18 months. So that's a massive program. They had to invest in that, but they saw it as an investment that would pay back rather than just being a cost center. And it's an ongoing difficult conversation, I know, happening inside organizations and brands every day about sustainability being a cost center and the amount of investment required.
Yeah. And I think that's a great example of a business that is designed to be more sustainable in a way that actually makes sense for consumers, because the refurbishing kind of return stock and sort of slightly damaged stock, or stuff that's less than pristine, but then selling it on as a essentially sort of second tier kind of stock. It's a great way to kind of price differentiate and make your proposition sort of accessible to others, who might not be able to afford the kind of the brand spanking new kind of price. But at the same time, it doesn't harm the brand. In fact, it probably is very additive to the brand as well. So yeah, I think that's a really great example of where they've designed the model and it actually makes sense to consumers and to them, and it's better for the planet as well.
And
Our time is nearly up, so thank you for your questions. I'd just like to move to our final question, which is I'd like our panelists to share their thoughts on what will have the biggest impact on how we build sustainable brands in the next 2 to 5 years. And maybe Katie, if you can start us with this one.
Yeah, so I think touching on Neil's point about Shein and transparency and what we might think is going to come down the line in terms of the data and like the expectations, I think AI is going to radically transform our ability to get solid data, and whether it's sort of being able to provide correct explanations on any sort of greenwashing claims. One of the tools that was developed at one of the Earth AI events was tackling this very problem with generative AI, but there are actually already solutions on the market doing this. So I think we can expect to see more of that. On the B2B side, sustainability reporting, there's a lot of AI-powered solutions now to sort of help validate real-time data on that, and also like emissions tracking as well. So we're going to have much better, more robust data. And I think just ultimately this data that's going to empower stakeholders to make better decisions, whether that's the customer or whether that's like a B2B organization's stakeholder map. So yeah, that's my one.
Thank you. And Neil?
Yeah, I think as I think you'll have more regulation. I think that will come kind of slowly as people kind of clamp down more on sort of greenwashing claims and just have a bit more kind of substance to some of these things that are going on. I think you'll also see, ahead of that curve, you'll see consumers getting savvier, just general education, but then also sort of supported by third-party kind of verification and third-party kind of sources. B Corp would be the kind of big example that's like really kind of hit the mainstream and people really kind of know what it is and recognize it as a sort of thing that adds to a brand. And then I think finally, I obviously work in the kind of startup scale up world, but I do think you'll kind of see mainstream doing more, mostly prompted, a bit like P&G and the kind of cardboard laundry capsule packaging. I think they'll do more prompted by the kind of what the startups are doing and the kind of the impact that they're kind of having. So I think it's all heading in the right direction, and it's it's up to us to kind of help shape that and to push it forward and all the rest. I'll be very happy.
There are reasons for us to be positive, but we need to make sure we're taking an active role.
Yes. I'll be very happy if P&G ever do cardboard packaging in the States because it's their biggest market. But we'll wait and see.
Thank you. And Mark.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think the three of us are probably all in a very similar space on this one. Maybe I can enhance rather than kind of think of anything new, but for me, it's transparency. There's kind of a term, radical transparency, which is being used a fair amount at the moment. And for me, that's like almost the opposite of green hushing. It's about sharing. It's almost like oversharing. It's sharing really frequently your wins and your losses. And there's reasons to do it from a regulatory perspective, but also from a brand building perspective. I suppose being honest about where you're falling short, but explaining how you're going to get there, how you're going to make up that gap. I think it suggests we haven't got all the answers. And if a brand can be radically transparent, then it's very hard to be accused of lying or cheating. And the regulations are coming. They're coming. They're coming fast, but they're also coming slowly. And we are going to get to a place, like Neil said, where you're going to have to communicate more. Frankly, I think you're going to get to a place in the not too distant future where any piece of communication from a brand is going to have to state what their carbon emissions are and maybe what they've achieved in other areas, much in the same way that kind of cereals have to say how much sugar in them. So it's definitely time to start being more transparent and authentic in what you're talking about. Get ahead of the game, both to respond to regulatory pressure and to build a deeper trust and connection with your brand and your consumer anyway.
Great, thank you. A really excellent and positive point to end on. So that wraps it up for today. So thank you so much, Katie McPhee, Neil Campbell and Mark Nelkin for sharing your insights and experience with us today. I definitely got a huge amount from our time together with lots of points to reflect on and actions to move forward with. Thank you to everyone for joining and your questions. And just a reminder, make sure you check out the CMO Circle newsletter that was sent out this morning, which includes a list of upcoming events and also the new episode of the CMO Circle podcast, which I'm looking forward to catching up on. And do connect with us all, and we'll send out the email with the recording and some other links shortly. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely Friday.
Helpful. Have a great weekend.
Thanks all.
See you.
All the best, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.